Right. Okay, I'm going to try again, and I think it's there. Okay.
Right.
Is that up?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So here we go. Where really the question David was posing to me was, where does road safety fit in the panoply of things in the department and perhaps in government more widely? And not for the first time, I found myself thinking back to these days. So back in the era, which many of you on the call will remember, particularly in the UK, Roads Safety Minister was Peter Bottomley. Back in 1980, I think it was roughly 86 to 88, something like that. And I was his private secretary for quite a bit of that time. And Peter was told, he shared with me, when he became junior minister by the head of comms in DfT, your job is to get out there and make road safety the #1 news story every day and do whatever it takes. So he did. And to his credit, he didn't care how silly it made him look. He didn't care who he engaged with or where he went. This is us at the National Motorcycle Show with Philippe Leroux and the Norton, which caused all of the anxiety about leg protectors. This is Peter, and I went to the Hells Angels 10th annual rally in Kent. There was no where he wouldn't go and nothing he wouldn't do, but he very much made his job the road safety minister with some other road bits attached, much to the irritation, I might say, of a whole number of officials. He also, and I will come back to this, had a director whose road safety, whose responsibilities included road safety, called June Bridgman, an absolutely terrifying person, I confess, but who shared the interest and the importance of road safety as an issue and was willing to invest quite a bit of her time in making sure it was high on the departmental agenda. And in those days, we had the famous targets. And I'll come back to targets a bit later on. But there's an issue here about what the ministers choose to do. And it's been coming in and out of fashion ever since then, I would say. So I have worked with ministers for whom this is an important part of their portfolio, and I've worked with ministers for whom this is something that they had to do in order to be allowed to do the rest of the things in their portfolio. Why might that be? Well, there are so many other things a transport minister could think about, even a roads minister, even Rachel McLean, the technology minister. They could be thinking about sexy things like driverless cars. They could be worrying about climate change. They could be thinking about sexy things like electric Porsches. There are a whole bunch of things that might just make for a slightly better photo opportunity. And there are other problems, so let's not forget this. Somebody said earlier, I think it was Mary, that there was a whole bunch of consensus in the room. It ends here with me. I think that's why David invited me. If I were sitting in number 10 Downing Street, worrying about things in general, I think I'd be worrying about these. And I think I'd probably be worrying about these more. It's not to say that I wouldn't worry about road safety, of course. But if you ask yourself, what is the Prime Minister's Transport Advisor Gilligan worrying about this afternoon? I think he's worrying about cycle lanes. And I think he might be drawn into other meetings in number 10 that are about the COVID crisis and how well it's going since the final restrictions were lifted off. And he might be worrying about some other things. So I just plucked a couple of numbers there just to put a bit of context. Okay, let's move on to the Department for Transport again, and where does road safety fit when we're thinking about safety in other modes? And here we have a different rail crash to the one that Norman mentioned, where a large number of people were killed. This is the Paddington rail crash, but not as many as were killed in that and the ensuing day on the roads. And we have recently the Boeing crisis with the 737 going down. Very different attitude to safety in those industries. And I think there are things that are common, there are things that are interesting. And one of the things I found most interesting was, sadly, the attitude to worker safety. If you think about rail safety for a moment, there's an awful lot of attention goes on passenger safety, not enough, I would say, on rail worker safety. A lot of the people who died since that crash at Paddington were rail workers. And we've had a similar thing, I think, with the fact that road workers, we need to improve their safety. Steve Ladyman made that a priority of his, but also people driving in the course of work. And again, I'm going to come back to that. But in the meantime, Norman touched on this. What sort of spectacular thing could possibly happen on the roads that would cause a large-scale media interest? Well, I can tell you, it was this event in 2011. It was the crash that people thought was caused by a firework display that clashed with a fog bank. And there was a crash and there was a lot of excitement. Unfortunately, I would say the excitement was mostly about the novelty of it being connected with a firework display and a bonfire, and less about the fact that it was a tragedy that ended up with people dead on the road. There are other instances which I could cite, which bother me hugely, about the fact that faced with a sign saying fog, slow down, many British drivers don't. I thought I'd pick this up. So I stole a slide from Roz, because 74 actions is a lot. I mean, we all want a comprehensive program, but take it from me, guys, trying to keep your arms around a 74 action program is really hard work by itself. And I found myself wondering whether it's the fact that we've got so many things to do that is making life more difficult in policy terms, more difficult to get your mind around, perhaps get your arms around. After all, where is the low-hanging fruit in road safety? Apologies, some of these images are, I grant you, a bit silly, but they're designed to be thought-provoking. We heard Norman talk about this. We're not going to talk about who used to say the phrase, just that it is quite clear that a massive, massive push over many years to get seatbelts fitted, to get them fitted front and back, to get them worn in the front, to require them to be worn in the front, to require them to be worn in the front and the back, has resulted in a major safety improvement. And yet, here we are, years later, and it's still the case that in the recent clampdown on one of our motorways that was publicised last week with Highways England's HGV truck spy vehicles, about half of the people pulled over because they weren't wearing seatbelts. Incredible, but you just have to keep bashing away at these things. But my point really is there were some big things here about the design of cars, about moving away from the design of Norman's Triumph Herald towards something that has a cage around the occupants of the vehicle that protects them, that gets rid of the lovely bonnet mascots that rip pedestrians to bit, that has a different profile, that has not just seatbelts but airbags. All sorts of things have been done. What's left to be done starts getting more and more difficult. And of course, now I'm thinking here, anyone looking at this picture would think this is obviously an illustration of the organisational challenge within the Department for Transport. I know, Dan, that's what you're thinking because I can see at the bottom of my screen. But my point really is this. Top left, that's a car. That's a real number plate, by the way. I took that picture. The guys who think about vehicles are in the International Vehicle Standards team, which is obviously you need people who are focused on that. And the people who are promoting cycling and walking and perhaps advising Paul McCartney that wearing shoes while crossing the road, not a bad idea. They're in another different bit of the department, another different bit of the building from memory, although I gather anybody can sit anywhere these days. The people, certainly the people who worry about the M1, for that's the road you can see bottom right, are in another different part. And the people who worry about drivers, well, that will be Pauline and her team. And there's a pretty typical British driver bottom left on your screens. And I just wonder, not we should pull all of these people together into one unit with one title. It's not going to happen. The issue turns up in many different parts of the department's activities. How can we make sure that it's pulled together? Because in my experience, thinking you pulled something together by making everyone sit in the same building simply means people sit in the same building, but they still don't talk to each other. And I think coordination is not about organisation, it's about coordination. So DfT responsibilities spread but could be brought together. I'm rather heartened actually by what I heard about views in the rest of Whitehall from Pauline and others, because my experience was trying to get anybody in the department for health, education, housing, or communities or environment to think about road safety was like drawing teeth, only I can draw teeth. It's painful. I could put pliers in my mouth and rip a tooth out. It can be done. Getting these people to take the slightest interest, I never achieved in my time in the DfT. And again, I could have put up a slide here just logging, or what are the issues at the front of the minds of the ministers in those departments, and are they going to turn their minds to helping us out here? This is a real problem with the Treasury. This is a real problem with the Treasury because the money that we save through improving the safety of our roads is a saving to the health department, the social services department. It's a saving to the Home Office through the police forces, through the fire service and the like. It's not a saving to the DfT. And it's one thing to come up with an economic appraisal, and it's quite another to come up with a financial appraisal. And it's even harder to come up with one where the savings accrue to somebody else, who, by the way, has already spent them. Plus, if you are working in number 10 this week, I think, as Norman was saying about how we derive our views from media coverage, you would be thinking that the biggest single policy issue that Britons face is how they're going to get on their next foreign holiday, which, by the way, almost certainly involves getting on an airplane and paying less fuel, whatever it is, carbon tax. It is quite remarkable, isn't it, that that should be such a worry, and such a worry for the centre of Whitehall, the centre of government, when in principle, arguably at least, they should be suggesting that we don't fly places. But then they probably suggested that we didn't go to Barnard Castle either. I'm very fond of this expression. I call it the yo-yo principle, and I would say this is what I think we need to be doing from here on, and it's not going to surprise David or anyone that this is going to be a Radio 4 link into why we need to take a fresh look at why collisions happen. And I call it the yo-yo principle because we really need to ask the question, why, oh, why is this happening? For example, here's an interesting case. So this is a tweet, a real one, posted yesterday by a driver being invited to do two 14-hour, nigh on 700-kilometre drives back to back. Why is this happening? Well, there's a driver shortage. How could his employer be allowed to do this? Because the government appears kindly to have relaxed the driver's hours restrictions. Economic anxiety took precedence over road safety. Thankfully, this guy, who certainly deserves recognition in next summer's honours list, said not doing it. But not every driver feels that brave. Not everyone wants to stand up to their boss. Not everyone thinks, well, I can't be asked to do something unreasonable. In fact, I suspect that quite a few of the drivers who've been dropping off the many, many parcels to my household that I'm now aware of because I've been working from home, they didn't feel particularly in a strong position. They felt like they were under significant time pressure, and that's not good for anyone. So why are these things happening? Well, one reason is people are under significant time pressure in the course of work. They're driving not because that's their job primarily. They might be driving because they're working in a different sector, the building sector maybe, or the retail sector. But their employer is not required to take as much interest in them as I personally think they should. And that's why I think we need to be standing back and thinking more about not just the safe system that everyone is bought into here, it's system thinking. And that's what sits behind our investigation of whether and why there should be a road collision investigation branch. And it is no secret, I think, again, to anyone on this call, that I personally have had a complete Damascene conversion on this, and I'm now totally sold on the idea. Because we don't have people making use of the increasing data and intelligence that we're getting these days in order to drill really down into what's going on here. And it's in that context, so this picks up from the last speaker we had before lunch, which is the vehicles that we're driving are getting more and more wrapped up with technology. And I've called it the end of anonymity because whether it's through dash cams or whether it's through other forms of electronic monitoring, we're getting to a point when our vehicle is going to know much more about our driving style than we remember. It's probably going to have an opinion. It's probably going to argue with us. All of that data is probably going to be available somewhere, but only if it's made available. And we're really quite concerned that at the moment, the work of the law commissions is focused so heavily on driverless operation that they're missing the point that this sort of vehicle, and this is not an uncommon position for a modern vehicle, is absolutely laden with driver assist and other monitoring technologies and all of that data is being harvested and is being guarded somewhere where the auto company wants it, because they think there might be a monetizable case for releasing it in some point in the future. We need to get at that and not wait for the driverless revolution. Plus, I should say, telemetry can take you so far, but Red Bull are still arguing that Lewis Hamilton caused the crash at the British Grand Prix. But I've got a very comprehensive explanation for you, also based on the telemetry, about why he didn't, why it was an ordinary driving incident. Even with all the data there, we're still going to get people arguing, and we're still going to get people like young Verstappen going into corners thinking, well, everyone will get out of my way, because that's how people seem to drive on the country roads where I live. Couple of closing thoughts here. I was under the impression that it was Peter Drucker who'd come up with things that aren't measured, aren't managed. And there's no evidence that Peter Drucker ever said it. But I did find this quote, and this is one that I will endeavour to make available to people afterwards. And I think it's really interesting. It's Lord Kelvin. It's long ago, but it's the more you know, but not just the more you know, the more you're able to express what you're after in terms of numbers, the better. Now, I confess, I'm on the fence on targets. I saw how targets worked as a rallying cry back in the late 80s. I was aware from the data we had that the targets that we set in the Transport Department would be met purely on the basis of the decline in motorcycle riding. Now, others who were around at the time might say it wasn't quite like that, but yes, they were ambitious targets in terms of the numbers that we were facing at the time. Whether they were really stretch targets, I'm not so sure. What will the target be now? Why would a minister commit to a target if they weren't reasonably confident of achieving it? And I think this comes back to what a group like this needs to be able to do. We have to be able to point to things that not only could be done, but things that could be done and are likely to be done. We've been fishing around in the foundation for a phrase to capture the idea that younger drivers, when newly qualified, might not have all of the same freedoms of people with more experience, but not call it graduated driver licensing, because graduated driver licensing isn't going to happen in this country anytime soon. Even Baroness Veer has made that clear, right? Just not interested. The term is putting people off. The fact that it's a difficult term that encompasses a whole variety of options is being missed, and we need to get a way around that. So we need some rethinking and fresh thinking. And on that bombshell, I'm going to be quiet.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's really interesting. And as Sean has just put in the chat,